The Medicare strike force recently arrested 300 healthcare professionals in the largest takedown of alleged government-sponsored health insurance fraud in U.S. history. As I said, it's the largest takedown in history, both in terms of the number of people charged, but also the loss amount. That's according to the Justice Department. And the majority of the cases being prosecuted involve separate fraudulent billings to Medicare, Medicaid, or both for treatments that were never even provided. Joining me now to talk about this is attorney Bryan Rotella. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
What is the Medicare strike force?
Danielle, the Medicare strike force is like the FBI for the healthcare programs that fund health insurance by the government, and those programs are predominantly Medicare and Medicaid. What I mean by the FBI is the Medicare strike force, which was put in place back in 2007, has spent the last almost decade looking around every corner for possible fraud in the healthcare system where untoward providers and folks involved in healthcare are gaming the system for dollars that ultimately are from the taxpayers.
And they haven't even been around for a decade, so it sounds like they've been busy.
To say the least, they've been busy, Danielle. There's been a total of 2,700 arrests and well over $8.9 billion in recovered funds. This strike last week was unprecedented in that there were 301 arrests nationally, totaling $900 million in alleged Medicare fraud.
That's a lot of money. How many were arrested here in Florida?
In Florida, it was approximately 60, and predominantly in what they call the highest risk areas or strike areas, of which Southeast Florida and Miami is one of the number one areas. And in that area, it included home health operators, pharmacies, and also chiropractors.
Bryan, were all these different healthcare providers in a ring? Were they all involved together, or were they separate?
That's a good question. Remarkably, some of this has some conspiracy tones to it, Danielle, but candidly, a lot of it is just independent, what I call Lex Luthors of medicine. What I mean by that is anyone who does my job, being a general counsel in healthcare, we're used to every day having to deal with the intricacies of billing and collecting. Doctors often have called it data entry algebra. And doctors and nurses and healthcare providers don't like to be involved in that side of medicine. They didn't get into it for that. They got into it to take care of folks. What that has opened the door is for these folks, these operators, oftentimes recruiters, who are bringing patients in to game the system by just purely submitting fraudulent claims to the government for Medicare and Medicaid.
These bribes result in patients receiving unnecessary care at the government's expense and also, I assume, taxpayers, right? How does this affect taxpayers?
Yeah, that's one experience on that. That's a great point, Danielle. One particular experience that was noted last week or incident was in Texas, where folks were being rounded up, given a $100 or $50 coupon outside of the McDonald's to get into a bus and go to a clinic where they were to be complaining of joint pain, neck pain, and back pain. And then those claims were submitted from that service that ultimately was part of the arrest and the strike force. Now, that takes a whole different view on a value meal. And unfortunately, that value meal was being paid by the United States taxpayers.
Wow. So they literally just shipped them in a bus and just had them lie about pain.
Absolutely. They for $100 or $50 in tough economic times, and you're preying on folks that are, at the lower economic means, and $100 and $50 is real money. You tell them to go in, and maybe their back hurts a little bit or their neck hurts, they're going to do it. And that gets submitted. And when you're talking about a country now where we have more folks submitting health insurance claims between Medicare and Medicaid and the Obamacare exchanges, it's hard to keep up with all these claims. The good news is the government got some of them last week. The bad news is there's a lot more out there.
Are any of these providers shaken up by this takedown, or are they continuing to do things like this?
Yeah, what I call, that's another great question, Danielle. It's the law of unintended consequences. What I mean by that is, again, doctors and nurses, and I've been representing doctors and healthcare providers for my entire career, whether it's in boardrooms or in the trials. They did not get into medicine, from my experience, as some type of mafia-related organized crime. They got into medicine to take care of patients. And in this particular day and age where there's so many more rules and so many more regulations, whether it be from the Affordable Care Act or all the other laws that are out there, we are at an all-time doctor shortage, and the doctor attrition rate is at an all-time high. When doctors and healthcare providers are reading in the news last week that 301 of them, and again, they only made up a small percentage, but 301 healthcare providers and businesses were arrested nationally, that's going to scare them out of the profession, and that's the last thing that the American patient needs right now.
What do you think is the driving force behind these businesses? What leads them to take these risks?
Well, it's money, 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 and paper, paper, paper. What I mean by that is you've got a system that is incredibly complex. I'm a healthcare lawyer and general counsel, and part of the problem is with folks like myself and legislators is we've created these rules and we've worked on these laws to a point where, like I said, it's such a complex system. It's very, very difficult for the average doctor who's hanging a shingle or nurse to really understand what's going on. So what happens is they have to outsource or outsource this to third parties or to some type of manager or administrator. And when you go to apply for a job, do you ask if your employer has been checked out by the FBI? That's not something folks normally do.
Right.
Now healthcare providers are feeling like they pretty much have to do that.
I'm curious, and perhaps you don't know this, but when that chiropractor had all those people get shipped over and make up complaints, do you know how much money they make off of each person?
I can't tell you specifically what the margins are, but the margins are extremely high and can go up even higher depending on how much volume it is. Medicare and Medicaid are a volume game, Danielle, and what I mean by that is the folks that are gaming the system want to get more bodies in, not less. So if you take the example about busing folks from McDonald's, that's exactly what they were doing. They didn't want 2 or 3 folks. They wanted hundreds of folks.
So those people obviously knew what they were doing. Are there people who go into doctors' offices and legitimately have neck pain or anything along those lines? And are these doctors scamming the system without these patients even knowing it?
Absolutely. And it's twofold. You also have patients that are scamming the system. I'm going to give you an example. It's known right now, it came out in the media about 3 or 4 months ago that it was reported that there's a massive fraud problem with Obamacare. So it's not just doctors and healthcare providers who may be submitting what are called false claims for patients who really did not need services or get services, but you actually have people out there that are making up claims in order to get subsidies from the government in order to pay for Obamacare-related insurance. So you have 2 prongs of fraud here. You have fraud at the provider level, and you have fraud at the patient level. Okay. All of that ultimately comes out of the U.S. taxpayers' coffers.
You also said something interesting. You say lawyers and legislators like yourself are part of the problem. Why would you say that?
Well, I can get you into alphabet soup with all the laws that we have and sit in a general counsel meeting with a healthcare company, and aside from being bored, the acronyms would be flying all over the place. What I mean by that is we've got a law called Stark, we've got anti-kickback, we've got false claims, we've got fee splitting. We put so many laws into the healthcare space to avoid fraud and abuse. What may be getting lost, and I believe is in the weeds, is ultimately the medicine. What that means is that it's extremely difficult for a doctor or a healthcare provider on their own to run their own practice today without having some manager or party in place to help them bill and collect. And the infrastructure and the cost for a doctor to go and add that group adds yet another burden on them. So what ultimately is happening, in my opinion, is doctors are losing that attention that they once had to just taking care of patients, and they're feeling increased pressure about what they have to bill for, and that's not good for any of us, particularly the American patients and ultimately for the American doctors.
So you're saying too many responsibilities are being pushed onto the doctors who really just need to be focusing on their patients.
That's correct. It's data entry algebra is what they call it. A doctor will spend often, and Danielle, if you've been to the doctor recently, you may have witnessed them in front of a tablet or a computer by the time you got to see them, and they were probably typing for maybe 50% of that visit. I bet many of your folks out in the audience have experienced that.
Yeah.
They're doing that to not pay attention to you. They're doing that because that's what's required in order for them to get paid, whether it be by private insurance or by the government. And if a doctor is spending half their time doing data entry, I can promise you, if you go into the opening classes or fall admissions at any med school, that's not the reason that they're there.
Right. Lots of pieces to this puzzle. Bryan Rotella, thanks so much for coming on with us tonight and sort of helping us untangle this mess.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Danielle.